Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you happen to be. And thank you for joining us on this special webinar for the 2025 International Day of Disaster Risk Reduction. My name is John Richardson. I'm the Executive Director for the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm delighted to be your host today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Bunurong people in the Kulin Nation, and I'd also like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all joining us today, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and acknowledge the tens of thousands of years that the Indigenous peoples have cared for this land, and the knowledge and wisdom that comes from that care for country, particularly dealing with the environment in which we are living in. And there's certainly a lot that we can certainly learn from. The UN's International Day of Disaster Risk Reduction is observed annually on the 13th of October, and it's here to promote a global culture of risk awareness and disaster preparedness. So it's a way that we can come together and focus on risk reduction. Of course, every day is a DRR day, but it allows us to actually kind of focus some attention. This year's theme is to fund resilience, not disasters, and the reason is urgent. While direct disaster costs are around, according to the UN's global assessment report, are around 202 billion a year, that is in US dollars. The real costs, including social economic losses, are closer to 2.3 trillion. So these are significant figures. Yet many governments, less than 1% of budgets goes to risk reduction. So that's the challenge that we're here to unpack. So to get us all thinking about this theme, before we get off into the panel, here's a live poll for you to have a bit of a think about. What you see is a number of questions there, and what we're going to ask you is, what do you see as the biggest barrier to funding resilience? Is it political focus on response over prevention, lack of compelling evidence or stories, short-term decision cycles, competing demands for limited resources? There's, of course, no right or wrong answer, just what you think. We're interested in what you think, and we will display the responses shortly. While you're thinking about this, I'm just going to run through some housekeeping sort of messages. Today's event's going to be recorded, as they always are, and made available along with the presentation slides after the event. If you subscribe to updates from AIDR, you will get a link to that when it comes out next. Our next updates from AIDR. Today we're going to be using the Q&A feature in Zoom to take questions, so please post your questions there and not in the chat window so we can keep an eye on them. You're going to be able to upvote the questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and we will certainly do our best to ask all of the questions to the panel. We encourage you to use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentation. This is a great way of engaging with what's going on. Just a reminder, you're going to need to use the select everyone in the drop-down menu so that everyone will get to see your chat. Also like to remind you that please be respectful to both participants and presenters when you are making any comment. Sorry. And then the last thing is please be aware that some of the content that we discuss may be distressing or bring up prior experiences. So in that instance, please use any techniques that you have developed to help you manage any adverse reflections. So moving on now to the business of the day. The conversations around this topic have increased in this country, in Australia, over the last decade or so, when we saw initially the Australian Business Roundtable series of white papers starting to kind of highlight the costs of disasters and the benefits of resilience building. We then saw a Productivity Commission report into disaster funding in 2015, which recommended an increased investment in risk reduction. More recently, we saw the establishment of disaster ready funds that has significantly increased national investment in DRR. And you can certainly learn more about the disaster ready funds and other policy initiatives by going and having a look at our Resilience Matters webinar, the third one in the series, which featured Andrew Minack from the National Emergency Management Agency. So we can see there's certainly a background to increasing investment in risk reduction in Australia. But now we're going to look at how we've taken that to another level. So I'm going to warmly invite my colleague, Dr. Maida Rashid, who's our Manager of Capability Development and Engagement, who will facilitate really hopefully entertaining and exciting panel of presenters. So over to you, Maida.
Yeah, thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone. Our live poll has now closed, and you should be able to see the result on the screen. So it's great to see so many of you have submitted what you think is the biggest barrier to funding resilience. As you see, the majority felt that the political focus on response over prevention and short-term decision cycles are the two main reasons for not as a barrier. So today, so let's get deeper into the topic. Today, we will explore this theme, funding resilience, not disasters, in three layers: local practice, research evidence, and policy making and funding lenses. Then we will open the floor for you for questions. Our speakers for today are Natalie Egleton, Chief Executive Officer from Foundation for Rural Regional Renewal, also known as FRRR. And then we have Paul Box, Senior Principal Research Consultant at Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, that's CSIRO. And finally, we will have Jimmy Scott, General Manager, Resilience and Recovery at Queensland Reconstruction Authority. Our first speaker, Natalie, will be speaking about the differences that upfront investment in resilience makes for communities, addressing the grassroots impacts that even small investments can make, and further action that is needed. Over to you, Natalie.
Thanks, Maida, and hello, everyone. Really delighted and pretty honoured to be able to talk to you today about some of FRRR's insights and experiences and share some case studies from our philanthropic work. I'm joining you from Darkinjung country on the central coast of New South Wales, so pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So FRRR, if we can just move to the next slide. Thank you. FRRR is a national philanthropic foundation. We're an intermediary structure, so we partner with other philanthropic trusts and foundations, corporates, businesses, individuals and governments to channel funding and deliver capacity building and capability development support to rural, remote and regional communities around Australia. So we've got a national remit. We were established in 2000, so 25 years old this year, and we've distributed a bit over $200 million to over 15,000 projects in that time, and obviously goes up every year. We just grant out about $20 million a year roughly, and our work really spans a fairly holistic and systemic lens and way of looking at, I guess, sustaining and strengthening the vitality of communities across rural and remote Australia in particular. And our focus areas are around building sustainable communities, resilient communities, vibrant communities and empowered communities. And disaster resilience and recovery is kind of embedded in our work. It has its own stream, but it is also something that we embed across all of our philanthropic work. And so we kind of really see the theme of this year's day as being really relevant to our work. And I'll speak through a bit of that as we go through. Thank you. So in thinking about the question of what some of the gaps and constraints might be, what might be holding us back from funding resilience, not disasters, I really thought about, and with our team's input, thought about what the practical reality is for rural and remote communities in Australia. We think, we hear a lot in the global context, in the policy, the Sendai framework, etc. We talk a lot in national terms. There's a lot of really good intent, but the practical reality for communities, people on the ground with responsibility at the end of the day for making risk reduction happen at the local level, whether that's through local councils, local not-for-profit organisations, First Nations, traditional owner groups, small businesses, etc. We really need to think about how to turn this ambition into reality and how to really shift the dial. So some of the, the things that we see and we live and breathe in our work is that, and unsurprisingly, the climate risk assessment that came out a couple of weeks ago highlighted the disproportionate impact of climate change and disasters on rural, remote and regional areas. And the reality is not only that there are more frequent, more severe disasters in those areas, but that it actually costs more to do everything. So recovery costs more, service delivery costs more, risk reduction actually costs more. And it means that the dollars that are put towards that mitigation work often don't go as far as they might in an urban area, for example. So that's, I think, a really practical constraint that we need to understand a lot more and factor into funding design. And the other part is just the right sized and right paced investment. Rural communities, and anyone in a rural area that's on the call today will absolutely know that disasters don't happen on their own, and in smaller population areas, more remote areas, the complexity of work and the interconnectedness and codependency of all of the issues that are affecting an area, whether it be housing, education, jobs, we've got big renewable energy transitions happening in a lot of places. You just can't absorb too many things at once, and you need to right size it and right pace it. So currently, I would say the funding system doesn't do these things, but there's certainly opportunities to do them more. The funding design side of things, which I just mentioned, it actually does, and I was really interested in the poll responses, and one of those being about the short-term cycle and short-term decision making. And whilst I completely agree with that, we need longer-term, multi-year funding. We need to acknowledge that this work doesn't happen in a year. It doesn't even happen in 3 years. It's actually ongoing and cyclical. But we do need short-term things as well. Short-term funding can actually just get momentum happening. It can mean that funding gets into activities that is that right size and right pace. But I would argue that we really need a spectrum, and we need to make sure that the investment ratios are balanced in the right ways, and that we're listening to communities and listening to local leadership about what that balance needs to be, and that we actually bake in flexibility so that we can adjust that. The engagement approach in terms of hearing that insight and that intelligence is really challenging in smaller and more remote areas. And I think the role of intermediaries like FRRR, like AIDR, like many others, is really critical for making sure that we can bridge that gap and get the right intelligence into the design process. And as I said, the small grants and multi-year funding, need to be considered as a suite and a spectrum rather than a and or. And then the other, the result of some of these constraints and gaps is that we end up with massive inequity. We end up with places in remote and rural areas that are already experiencing structural inequity because of their distance, because of their size, where service systems and funding programs and systems aren't necessarily designed for their context. They're designed for more populated areas with larger organisations, with larger levels of infrastructure. So when we think in disaster risk reduction terms, and even in disaster recovery terms, the reality that these places and the organisations in them often lack time, they might lack the skills or the depth and breadth of skills that are needed, and the number and volume of people to be able to manage the funds and manage the complexity of projects. A lot of the requirements for co-funding or matched funding in a range of different funding programs can actually exclude those organisations who do not have, and communities who just don't have the capacity or the scale to be able to raise that kind of capital in a matching environment. I know some work's been done towards that in the Disaster Ready Fund, which has been encouraging. But our argument would be, let's simplify, let's make it less competitive, and let's actually reward collaboration rather than necessarily the dollar matching process. So thinking about what one thing might make a difference before I get onto some sort of case studies and examples is I think, and it's what's been called for in the theme of today, is that we need to embed disaster resilience outcomes across and within all types of funding. And at FRRR, I guess our experience as a funder and an intermediary is that we often find ourselves trying to join dots between siloed elements of funding. We might be providing funding in education, health, housing, etc. And all of them, actually, if they all have resilience dividends, we will actually reduce risk across the board. And I think we all kind of know that instinctively and intrinsically, but it's not the way that funding systems are currently designed. So our argument would be, let's actually think about how we can do that, and might require some small experiments, some collaborations, some partnerships to give it a go in different settings. And certainly place-based models are where we can get some traction in learning how to do things differently and how to embed resilience across different funding streams. So to go into some examples, thanks team. As I said at the beginning of FRRR, you know, we make grants at a relatively high volume each year and nationally, and we get the opportunity through that work to learn really deeply and work really closely with community partners. Our programs and granting opportunities span a spectrum of small grants that are one-off, just really great things to keep communities ticking, right through to long-term or longer-term multi-year place-based initiatives that have a blend of funding and capacity building and capability lift, etc. So the two projects on this slide here are both in some of our more place-based work. And the one on the left is really, I mean, when we think about risk reduction and community-led risk reduction, disaster risk reduction, and embedding this kind of disaster resilience lens, sometimes it can be easy to overcomplicate things, but really it can be quite simple. And it is about people working together, and it is about joining up different parts of systems. And this project in Korumburra in Victoria really came about from the local community recognising that there needed to be more connection between local community and their knowledge and understanding of emergency preparedness and the local emergency management system and local council, so that when something does happen, everyone's on the same page. They've got the same information and they have the same tools and the same understanding about who is going to be doing what and in what ways. So this project was really about developing shared plans that could be leveraged by different parts of the sectors involved in the emergency management system. It's relatively new. It hasn't been in place for a long time and probably hasn't been road tested to a huge degree yet. But what it has done so far, and this is the great thing about disaster risk reduction work, is that you get the dividends early and they will have benefits across the community. So they've developed relationships, they've developed more inclusive networks. People who haven't been involved in other types of planning processes have been involved in this one. And so it's really reducing isolation within the community and building more understanding of the people and the place. So reduction of siloing of information is a really key outcome of that initiative as well. In Limestone Coast in South Australia, this project had a focus on really harnessing and sharing learning and wisdom from First Nations, understanding of seasons and the 6 seasons that occur in that region with their sort of lens on local flora and fauna and how that changes with those 6 seasons. This is a really diverse region. There's a strong agricultural base. There's a lot of migrant settlement. There's a lot of generational farming and agriculture as well. And understanding drought through that seasonal lens has been a really important way for the local community to build a different way of connecting with each other and a different way of seeing how mitigation can be worked on early. At the earliest signs of seeing the local landscape change through little signals that they learned from First Nations wisdom has meant that there's this incredible generational learning transition as well, and really engaged way of understanding change in the environment and then how to actually support nature to heal and be taken care of through something like drought. Thank you. It is a beautiful project, Bastian. Thank you. And just the final two. So Cherbourg in southeast Queensland, possibly well-known region for a lot of people, and particularly those from Queensland. We have been working with the Red Earth Community Foundation, which is a place-based philanthropic organisation, for the last few years, with some funding through NEMA and Minderoo Foundation, to partner with organisations across that region on disaster preparedness and disaster risk reduction. And in Cherbourg, we have supported them to upgrade, I guess, the preparation of the ration shed, which is a really important historical and cultural place, extremely important to the nation's truth-telling, healing process in particular. And there are a lot of very significant cultural assets and memory in that place as well. And the building itself was not particularly ready for the kind of disasters that we're looking at experiencing. And so that project was really practical. It was about improving the building itself, temperature control, so that we could preserve artefacts, fireproofing, storage. So really simple, practical things that will just mean that the community has confidence that they can preserve and protect those assets. But in the process of that has been a process of really recognising the importance of those assets, of engaging others in the region and the community, and placing its importance front and centre as something to preserve and protect. So it had a lot of cultural value and a lot of other resilience dimensions that were delivered beyond the physical improvement. And then just finally, arts, as I'm sure many of you will agree, is an incredibly powerful tool for strengthening resilience. It's used beautifully in recovery, as we know, but in preparedness and disaster risk reduction can be really powerful as a way of, I guess, strengthening trauma-informed practice, providing ways for people to develop their own psychological preparedness and work through processes that are not necessarily through words and actions, but through other expressions. And so the beauty of arts work in this disaster risk reduction space is about that sort of reduction in isolation and the ability for people to connect with each other on a level that they might not have otherwise walking down the street or seeing each other at a forum or a workshop. And so that reduction in isolation before a disaster, as we all know, means that when something does happen, people have social connections, that social capital is strengthened, and there are ways for the community to come together and support each other if and when something happens. Thank you. Conscious of time, so I'll leave it there and happy to pick up conversations with anyone. We have hundreds and hundreds of communities and projects that we've supported over the years, and will continue to support. Our ambition and our goal as an organisation is really to help shift the dial in this space. We think moving towards a greater ratio of spend on preparedness and risk reduction is absolutely essential. If we don't do that, we will continue on a treadmill that's not going to get us ahead. And we're just really excited to be collaborating and partnering to help that become a reality. So thank you. Thanks, Maida.
Oh, what a fantastic presentation. And from all these little clap and hearts, we can see how much our audience also appreciate that. So thank you, Natalie. Our next speaker is Paul, and he will discuss the evidence base for investment in resilience and the data that funders and policymakers need to inform resilience investment. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Maida. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Box from CSIRO, and I'm one of the co-leads of an enabling resilience investment initiative that we'll be talking about a little bit today. Before I begin, though, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm dialing in from today, which is a place we now call Sydney. Pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And also thanks to Ada for organising this event and for the invitation to talk. I'll be reflecting briefly on efforts throughout the ERI programme to enable investment in resilience. And I'll try to bridge between the themes of my two co-presenters, Natalie and Jimmy, around community and infrastructure resilience. So next slide, please. What I'd like to talk about very briefly, I'll touch on community resilience and the role of infrastructure in enabling it. Briefly look at the funding environment, highlight some of the key challenges in making the case for investment, and then briefly highlight an ERI project which kind of pulls some of the threads together and demonstrates some of these approaches. For the talk, it's going to be primarily focused on infrastructure resilience, and I'm trying to provide a bit of a systems perspective, but really or a systems view, but from the perspective of those who are seeking funding for actions on the ground. Next slide, thanks. So from a disaster risk reduction perspective, resilience is a system's ability to sustain itself and withstand and absorb shocks and adapt to changing conditions. And community resilience really is stems from individual and collective resources or capitals, if we look at the diagram on the left-hand side. Social networks, trust, natural resources, etc., that help communities manage stress and recover from shocks. But as Natalie has clearly pointed out, resilience isn't just about coping with adversity, which is a risk framing. It's about enabling growth and change. Now, if we look at our interconnected infrastructure, it's operated by many different agencies, government, private sector, and it really underpins effective functioning of society and economy. Damage to infrastructure, both critical infrastructure and the often less visible social infrastructure, impacts on all aspects of community well-being. So we need to really think about our infrastructure resilience. Next slide, thanks. So how do we think about assessing resilience? There's a couple of examples here. The excellent AIDR framework, which is a national index of community resilience, focusing on coping capacity and adaptive capacity, using a range of indicators, which really try to characterize some of these stocks of capital and assess resilience. Another great example, organized around capitals, the recovery capitals, which is a great tool to help think about and understand the stocks and flows of these different kinds of capitals in place, and supporting efforts to work with community and a range of stakeholders to actually prepare for and recover from shock events. So the third framework on the left-hand side here, one I just want to draw folks' attention to, is a global infrastructure risk model and resilience index. It's a framework to assess infrastructure resilience developed at a global and national scale, but we're finding it quite useful as a way of starting to benchmark and compare resilience across different classes of infrastructure, and doing that in place-based ways. Next slide. So turning to making the case for investment, it's pretty well established. Numerous studies, wide-ranging values related to return on investment, always positive, always significant. The table on the screen is from a great ALGA report, Adapting Together, provides a range of benefit cost ratios there, and also highlights the fact that councils are already investing huge amounts of money in this space. While these studies are important for promoting resilience investment, the main challenge is actually in securing funding for on-the-ground actions, given it's a very competitive environment. Many council and infrastructure owners, those who are responsible for taking action, a range of others as well, lack the necessary budget, so they have to make a strong case for external investment. Next slide, thanks. So what does that external funding environment look like? A range of sources, from targeted disaster management to these much more broad notions of risk-informed sustainable development, which are funding programs which put things into the landscape, and investment in infrastructure. We've got the disaster recovery funding arrangements with an increased focus on betterment, the disaster ready fund, an investment in risk reduction, but always oversubscribed. We have a range of philanthropic investments. Interesting to see increasing grant funding mechanisms being set up by corporates, including the insurance industry. And then we have a range of the really broad range of sector-specific resilient investments for particular sectors or classes of infrastructure. The example there is around the STAND program, strengthening telecommunications against natural disasters, and then a much broader set of government grants for development and major public and private investments in infrastructure. Now, these can build resilience if they account for risk under a changing climate, but they can also increase vulnerability if they don't. A lot of the funding in this space, or the investment, capital investment in the space, actually comes from, in infrastructure, comes from the private sector. And there's a push to leverage this investment. Government alone cannot afford to pay for the kinds of investments we need. And there's also a push and a drive to try to catalyze and leverage the larger institutional investment superannuation funds who have money but struggle to find investment. So next slide, thanks. So some of the challenges in this funding environment: individual organizations lack sufficient budget. There's a funding gap, lots of statistics around this. But the result is that it's a highly competitive environment for seeking funding. And we also have, because there are numerous funds, funding sources, each of which has its own objectives, application processes, requirements for business case development, really creates challenges for those that are seeking funding in this space. Next slide. And this is particularly problematic. That the fragmentation in this environment is problematic because we know that we need more coordinated long-term multi-stakeholder efforts to reduce risk. It's a shared responsibility, typically requiring lots of different kinds of interventions from different actors. And these include, treating the hazard, hardening the asset, meeting service needs in a different way, building coping capacity, changing the rules and regulations even. The photograph that we're showing here is from a telecommunications resilience project we're working on with Optus at the moment, and it really highlights the challenge for an infrastructure provider. What you're seeing is a site of a telecommunications base station, small site around that. The tower provider and telecommunications company can only manage risk within that site area. They need to collaborate with others beyond the site area to, for example, address the fuel load risk presented by the trees in the area. So this requires a lot of effective or more effective risk reduction, more coordination and integrated place-based approaches. Now, local government really plays a central role in these efforts. It has to identify community needs, prioritize investments in its own infrastructure. It manages a lot of infrastructure, and then coordinating efforts across a whole range of other stakeholders as well. Next slide. So a couple of the challenges in making the case for investment are really around the complexity of our systems and a limited ability to predict how natural, social, economic, technical systems are going to interact and respond to shocks. We've got a great deal of uncertainty under a changing climate around the magnitude of hazard, intensity, duration, frequency, interaction of hazards. There's limited evidence of in many cases, of interventions, although I think Jimmy will be talking about that in the next presentation. And finally, the costs and benefits are even unevenly distributed, those being asked to pay, those who are benefiting. Sometimes the location of intervention and the location of benefit are different. And often these benefits only materialize or become obvious and quantifiable after a hazard event has occurred. Next slide. So we're trying to address some of these challenges through an enabling resilience investment initiative. And we've developed an approach that we're continuing to trial, pilot, and use. And it's a place and a systems-based methodology that enables us to work with stakeholders to help them assess risk and opportunities and identify resilience building interventions. So to do this, we really focus on trying to develop a clear resilience investment logic. So what are the resilience needs and benefits that align with and support strategic objectives in a particular place. We focus deeply on trying to understand not only the value protected, so this is the avoided damage and disruption losses, but also value creation. So thinking about this triple dividend, what are the economic benefits that accrue regardless of if there's a disaster event? And what are some of the other socio and environmental benefits which often don't get factored into business cases and for investment? Next slide, thanks. So turning to a case study of a project with an ERI project with the Bigger Valley Shire Council. The Shire is a regional New South Wales council on the border with Vic. It's got a long coastline, sparse and distributed population, and a large infrastructure asset base that's highly exposed to bushfire, flood, storms. And we worked with the council and a range of other stakeholders to pilot the development of a resilient investment case. So this was trying to make an improved case for council infrastructure resilience investment, accounting for broader set of benefits of the investment. The pilot focused on roads, as these were recognised as being really the priority infrastructure fundamental to achieving the strategic, social, economic, and risk reduction objectives for the council. And the process involved defining the services and functions that a road provides. Rather than thinking about a road as an asset, what are the services and functions it provides? How does that play out in specific areas? The map on the right-hand side there shows these different areas, different service needs, freight into and out of the region, tourist routes, and evacuation routes for communities along what we call the String of Sapphires. So we worked through a process of identifying those service needs, beginning to think about the benefits of the services in those areas and the disbenefits if they're lost. What are the vulnerabilities in those areas, and what are the potential interventions to address them? So those are the dots you can see in that map there. And as part of this process, we deliberately, and it is important to look at the system from a variety of different perspectives and scales, which is why you're seeing some overlapping areas there. Next slide. Thank you. And then we pulled all of this together into a resilient investment case. And this really describes the investment logics. What are the social, economic, development, and risk reduction objectives, and the resilient service needs that are required to address those. So this includes the set of possible interventions and a broad quantification of their costs and benefits. And we delivered all of this in a tool, a decision support tool, a very prototype tool that helped us that was designed really for users to help them explore, analyze, and support decision making around how they could package interventions together and submit those as part of development of a business case to different funding sources. And this kind of recognized that this is the reality for those seeking funding, particularly councils, that they have to be very responsive to the funding source. They have to be very responsive to the shocks that they experience, and they're managing very long to-do lists, and there are many different options for intervention. So this is a tool really to help support that kind of decision-making process. I'll just draw your attention to the resources down in the left-hand side. There's a couple of links here to technical reports that CSIRO produced on the project, and an excellent paper that Gemma Edwards from Bigger Valley Shire Council put together, which was really reflecting on the approach and the experiences that the council had. And with that, I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. Some great example of investments for resilience. And now our final speaker, Jimmy. Jimmy will explain how funding decisions are made, barriers to prioritizing resilience, and examples of successful funding models. Over to you, Jimmy.
Yeah, thanks, Maida, and it's fantastic to be with you all here today. I'd like to thank John and your team for pulling this together. I can see from the comments we have people not only from Australia and New Zealand, but from right around the world, which is is great to see on this International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. So I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, being the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining today. Next slide, please. So since QRA was established in 2011, we've had 135 disaster events, and I think this diagram graphically illustrates part of the challenge that many of our communities are facing. Cascading, compounding events, end-to-end events. You know, in the last 12 months, we had 17 disaster events in Queensland. And it's a graphic illustration of Queensland being the most disaster impacted state in Australia. In terms of speaking about funding decisions and how they're made, I think it's important to probably just reflect upon some of the journey that QRA has been on in that time. Like I've been with QRA now since almost the beginning in 2012. And I remember that in the early days, the term betterment, which, you know, is building back our infrastructure to a more disaster resilient standard, betterment was synonymous with not eligible. And that was the case right around the country. You know, many people will recall that the funding arrangements at the time made it very difficult to build infrastructure back to a more disaster resilient standard. But thankfully, that journey has now taken us to a point where betterment is no longer synonymous with not eligible. It's actually now integrated in everything we do. And I'd like to just, I guess, take you on a bit of a journey of where we've come in Queensland. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we saw when QRA was established is that much of the damage that occurs around our state, there are certain areas that are disproportionately impacted. And you can see here on the map, this is a product that we have in QRA called the Repeat Event and Dollars Index, which essentially looks at local government roads and those roads, what frequency and what severity have they been damaged. And you can see we've got hotspots that have been developed. And we have this for right across the state, where it identifies these hotspots of certain areas that are routinely damaged more frequently and to a higher dollar value than others. And really, it gave the opportunity to then look at, well, what if we were to actually build those roads back to a more disaster resilient standard? We could actually help our communities be far more resilient into the future in terms of maintaining connectivity and the like. Next slide, please. So that gave rise to the Queensland Betterment Fund. Now it's jointly funded under the Australian and Queensland government, but since the first program that was implemented in 2013, we've had almost 1,000 projects that have been delivered across the state. And the avoided reconstruction cost is almost $1 billion. I recall when we pulled together the first cost benefit analysis to government, you know, way back then, we were estimating the benefit at the time, and we were estimating that the payback period might be somewhere between 10 and 20 years. In practice, it was far quicker than that. It was closer to probably 5 to 7 years. So it was actually far more successful than it was ever, I guess, ever forecast to be initially. Now, it's subsequently become a voluntary, one of Queensland's voluntary commitments under the United Nations Office Sendai framework, disaster risk reduction. But again, the benefit that we are, I guess, able to articulate here in terms of 988 million, the true benefit to Queensland is actually far greater than that. You know, often there's a rule of thumb for every direct benefit, there's essentially that again in indirect benefits, you know, in terms of keeping roads open to allow goods to get to market, people to get to work, people to get to school, people to get to hospitals, etc. There's about a 1-to-1 rule of thumb there. And what we've tried to really understand is put a bit more science and a bit more quantification behind that. And I'll take you on a couple of examples. So next slide, please. The image that's up here, that may be familiar to many, and the image is probably very familiar to many. Many of you may have been there or holidayed there in the past. This was the Gold Coast a few days after Tropical Cyclone Alfred crossed. Now, quite significant impacts to the beaches you can see here. It was estimated that more than 4 million cubic meters of sand was taken away. Now that's an enormous amount of sand. If we look at the direct cost that's actually had, direct cost to infrastructure, there's actually not an enormous direct cost. Very few linked to the damage to those beaches. Very few roads were impacted. Very few bridges, etc. But the indirect cost is massive. The Gold Coast is an area that is absolutely reliant on tourism. You don't have a functioning Gold Coast economic area without the beach and without the ability for people to come and enjoy that part of the coastline. So there was a massive benefit associated with investment, and that was one of the things that was considered when the Australian and Queensland government approved the coastal recovery program for that area. But this is, I guess, one of the examples that you can have projects that while on the surface may have a direct benefit of a certain amount, the indirect benefit of investment in that area is enormous, which, if you go to the next slide, please, is one of the reasons that we've done quite a bit of work now on trying to put a bit more science on that. So a few years ago, a number of you may be familiar, there was a body of work called the Resilience Valuation Initiative, which was a multi-jurisdictional Australian government. Each of the states was involved, but it was trying to put a bit more science behind that benefit of the indirect benefits from that investment. We, as a result of that work, undertook work on refining a tool called SAVI, the Sustainable Asset Valuation Initiative. And that's what we've been using to try to better quantify the benefits that this type of investment brings. One of the things that we're seeing in terms of our engagement with central agencies, with Premier's Department, with Prime Minister's departments, with Treasuries, etc., is funding is becoming far more contestable, and this is something that will grow. It won't diminish. Our funding is becoming more contestable. Governments have massive competing demands: education, health, defence, etc., etc. So, in terms of when we are seeking funding in this space moving forward, we have to be able to very clearly articulate the benefit that this investment is bringing. We've actually just recently been successful in a CSIRO grant to work with the Queensland University of Technology to appoint a PhD student to look at this very thing in terms of simplifying the approach so that these assessments can become far more repeatable and applicable to the funding requests that we make. I mentioned before about the rule of thumb, 1-to-1. Our treasuries aren't interested in rule of thumbs. They want to see the data, and that's why this work is so important. Next slide, please. And then also, this work has, even though it was designed very much with a Queensland focus in mind, it has applicability more broadly. We've been working with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who are implementing a Partnerships for Infrastructure program, which is essentially a Southeast Asia infrastructure development program of the Australian government, to essentially simplify the tool and have it applicable to projects and areas in the Southeast Asian context. So currently, the SAVI tool is actually being applied by the Thai Ministry of Infrastructure to projects within Thailand, which is fantastic. And last week, I was actually invited by DFAT to present at the Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum in Bangkok to actually go through the work that is happening in this space, because there's a lot of opportunity to apply this regionally, but then also there's a lot of opportunity to take those learnings from its regional application and then bring it back home to Australia and to Queensland to improve our approach to this work here. So thank you very much again. Next slide, I think is my final. And very keen to join the discussion.
Thank you, Jimmy, Natalie, and Paul, for these fantastic presentations. I will now turn to the Q&A. to ask some of the top questions that have come through from the audience. So we have some comments around disaster ready funding's complexities. And one of the questions that Mihi Joshi is asking, that one of the critical challenges for the critical infrastructure resilience is the operation and management, as the life cycle cost is much higher than the capital cost. And in the rural and remote areas, this challenge increased multifold. How can we engage local stakeholders and provide them with skills and know-how in the challenge? It would be good to know your thoughts on these issues. So Natalie, did you want to answer this question?
Sure. I mean, this sounds like a very large scale infrastructure question. FRRR's work tends to be in the smaller scale end of things, so my answer is slightly skewed that way. But I think local skill development and the point in the question about the increased complexity and added cost in rural and remote areas is absolutely right. And so that needs to actually be factored in. And I think some of my comments about the longer term nature of funding is relevant here. For even the infrastructure projects that we support, it might be an upgrade to a hall, it might be putting renewable energy on something or doing something around water security, for example. Generally they need a couple of years to do something that you would think be very straightforward, just because of the issues with getting things to communities and getting trades, etc. And then the ongoing management part of it is really important, because in smaller areas, and when you think about community-based infrastructure, whether it's a hall or a place that's used as a place of last resort or community gatherings, often they're run by volunteers. And those volunteers might have really strong skills and experience in running amazingly complex businesses. They're likely to be farmers or business owners, etc. But the reality of maintaining infrastructure that is there to serve the public is often something that needs a lot more investment, and I think a lot more focus on how to leverage the capabilities that are within a region without expecting that you can get new capability necessarily or new capacity necessarily. So thinking about how to leverage whatever is in local council, and every local council has different types of roles and different types of capacity and scalability as well. And thinking about some of the unusual actors, really thinking systemically about what is in a place, so that you can support the ongoing maintenance and management of places. And that will depend on places, so I won't go into specifics of what that could look like. But I think the reality is longer term funding, an appreciation of ongoing cost and building that into the funding, and building in capability and collaboration lift are things that would help.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Next question from Larissa is, can you provide more clarification about what you mean when you said that private investment into resilience can lead to more vulnerability in some cases? I believe Paul, it was directed to Paul. Paul, do you want to answer this question?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So we find that some investments can be maladaptive. So if a decision is made about infrastructure, and particularly infrastructure that lays down path dependencies, or infrastructure that is going to be there for a while, and it doesn't account for the magnitude and change of hazard that's likely to occur in that area, then we're sometimes increasing risk. So the bit of infrastructure won't necessarily last for as long as it needs to, or be built to a sufficiently high standard. Sometimes we're seeing that another example might be we're looking at, we did some work looking at renewable energy for a community in Cobargo, and looking at alternate models for community ownership and management of a islandable renewable energy microgrid. And one of the challenges there is that if a commercial provider comes in and sets up photovoltaic cells, so solar panels, it will look at making a profit, or look at its revenue stream over a particular period of time, and after that time it doesn't necessarily care too much about what happens to that asset. It might on-sell that asset. Again, if that asset over its entire life cycle does not account for the magnitude of hazard, then we'll end up building more infrastructure that just isn't fit for purpose. So I think there are a few examples of that, and maladaptation, if we're building things back in places, you know, that we shouldn't be building back in at all, then it's sending problematic signals to community, and I think a lot of the decisions we make implicitly at the moment are implicitly defend decisions. We will defend, we will always be here, and we're in the space now where we're starting to for very high risk communities engage with conversations about relocation. So all of these things need to be factored in when thinking about investment and the decision timeframes really for investment.
All right, thanks, Paul. I think I will take the last question here. That we have been discussing the importance of resilience over investment and the funding since early 2010s, and why today we are still need to talk about this. Why things haven't changed so far? What explains this inertia in the mindset of governments, communities, and other stakeholders? Jimmy, do you want to comment on that?
I think there's been enormous change. If we look at the initial Productivity Commission report that came out in 2014, that widely quoted 97% goes into response and 3% into resilience. That was actually out of date in Queensland when it was released, because it didn't take into account the betterment program that was implemented in 2013. So if we look at where that sits currently, I think NEMA, National Emergency Management Agency, have advised that it's probably closer to about 85% into response and 15% resilience. What that means is there's been massive change, but there's still a lot more to do. If we look at the most recent disaster that we had in Queensland, we had almost $400 million approved solely for betterment, which was a large share of the reconstruction program that was underway. So I do think that there's been enormous change, and there's still more to do. But one of the things we always have to recover. So I don't think it's a binary. We do recovery or resilience. If a community is impacted, we always have to help them get back up on their feet to assist them recover in what recovery may look like for that community. So that will mean recovery will remain an absolute priority moving forward, but we are absolutely investing far more in resilience now than we were just a few years ago.
Thank you, everyone, for a great session. Jimmy, Natalie, and Paul and Maida for wrangling the questions. We've heard some fantastic perspectives today from communities through to thinking about the complexities of infrastructure and then looking at sort of how governments are sort of trying to tackle the challenge. And I think to Jimmy's point just then, I mean, it is complicated, and this is a complicated space, and it's shifting mindsets to how do we do more and embed sort of a resilience to thinking and make sort of risk reduction sort of everyone's business. And I think listening to Natalie sort of speaking at the start, where just being able to sort of realise we are actually seeing the benefits being realised from resilience in a myriad of different ways, but we often don't necessarily count those. So I hope you've enjoyed that session and take something away from that. I just again like to acknowledge Maida Rashid for facilitating this conversation. And Angela Draper and Charlotte Fell in the AIDR team for their work on making the webinar possible. Just like to acknowledge that the financial and technical support of the National Emergency Management Agency in bringing bringing us to the forefront. Our next webinar is going to be the second webinar in the Spotlight series on the 28th of October, 1 to 2 p.m. With Mark Duckworth from Deakin University, looking at do governments trust communities, how to build on and maintain trust in the age of grievance and disinformation. You can see that there's a link there. When you leave the call, you'll be taken to a short survey. We'll use this information to ensure that our professional development programs continue to meet your needs. It's been my absolute pleasure to host this session this afternoon with you. And until next time, I encourage you all to advocate, partner, and fund resilience and not disasters. On behalf of AIDR, thank you for joining us today, and go well.